Here's a tutorial on setting up alerting system in Grafana. So this tutorial will be in two parts. So this is part one of the tutorial. I'll go through the setup and architecture in this video and then go through the code in the next video. What are the instances where you might use this? So let's say you have a sensor that gives you some data every few minutes and you would like to know uh, if it's time to replace the battery, or if the sensor goes above or below a certain threshold, you want to be notified on your Grafana dashboard. So this home panel works like a notification system for your Grafana dashboard. So this is what the dashboard looks like. So we receive alerts from an API call, and they come up here, and so the user has to acknowledge them once they see the alert. And instead of refresh interval as off, I can do last 1 minute. So this panel get refreshed every 1 minute, and if there's new data coming from the API, so this panel will get refreshed every minute. And you can decrease down to 5 seconds based on Grafana settings. So let's keep it at 1 minute. And once you acknowledge something, all the acknowledged stuff will come down on this table, which is part of the same panel. So you can keep track of the history of all the alerts or warnings you have received with the time it was acknowledged. So this is essentially what the alerting system looks like. Now, a little bit about this architecture. This is essentially, right now, this panel is built just using Grafana. I'm not using APIs. So in the next tutorial, we'll be updating this panel with some real-time data using APIs to update the alerts and acknowledge the alerts. So for the architecture, I have a Grafana running. I'm using data source as I'm using data source as static API right now. In the next tutorial, we'll be updating the static API to Infinity API. So my data source is static, and this panel is called Dynamic Text Panel. And both of these panels are from Volcov Labs. You guys should check them out if you're using Grafana for any of the projects. They have some very cool panels. So this is the static data source panel. What it does is you can define your static data source just like you'll define a database in Grafana as data source, or an API in Grafana as a data source. And we're also using the dynamic text panel, which lets you do a bunch of fancy stuff on Grafana panel itself. So you can write HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Uh, so that's what we're using for the dynamic text panel. Now, eventually where we want to reach is instead of static data source, we want to use Infinity API, and then we'll build some APIs on Node-RED that will get triggered by Grafana, and you'll see the panel, our notification system update real time. And for that, we'll be using Infinity API. So instead of defining data source as static data source, we'll be using data source as Infinity APIs, which basically lets you hit REST APIs on the Grafana panel itself. So just to give you a quick look how this alerting system is built. Again, I'm using the dynamic text API, dynamic text panel from Volcov Labs, and I have defined a static data source that's called alerts, and I have some fields and some values. So if we look at the raw data here, it looks like this, which is again all static. It's a mock-up data, so nothing defined, nothing is coming from the API right now, which we'll do in the next tutorial. So we have the status, if it's acknowledged, and what was the acknowledgement time if it was acknowledged. Here I'm using JavaScript code and styles, and editor is HTML. So I've defined all of these tables in HTML, and then assign some JavaScript events to few of the blocks. So what happens if you hit acknowledge, it'll trigger an API that will save the alert in a database, and then what you'll see on the bottom is the acknowledged alert. And it's a pretty big code, but it's pretty simple code. And then I've defined some CSS to make it look the way it does. And we'll be going through all of this in the next tutorial, also hooking up an actual API that will build using Node-RED. So you could see this whole notification system updating real time as more data starts coming from the API, or there are more events, more alerts or alarms or warnings uh, coming out from the API. So I hope that this kind of gives you an idea how you can use Grafana for like as a notification system. Uh, Please feel free to ask any questions in the comment sections if you have any, and I'll also add links to the plugins and the data source that we are using in the description below.